Hello space goers and astronauts of all ages. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you the basics of generating power for your ships. Hooray! Power! Alright, first thing to do is let's get a ship started. Now, power blocks you can just place wherever you want and they will generate power. As you can see over on the left here, I am generating power, but it could be a lot more efficient. So, let's say I make a generator that has 5 blocks. Well, that's good. Let's say I add another 8 to it. There we go, all 8 blocks added. Now we've got a total of 1,074 generation a second. That seems pretty decent, right? Wrong. See, this is actually a very poor way to place it. Just like if I was filling in a large segment and just placing blocks, it would actually end up with a pretty terrible power rating compared to what you can get. So with these same extra 8 blocks that I added, I will add 4 on top and then 4 out one of the sides. Suddenly my power generation is actually more than doubled what it was initially. And that's because you get a bonus for the total dimensions of a single group of power reactors. Now, these power blocks are all touching, which makes them all part of the same reactor. However, it counts all this internal space as if it were a complete square and generating power. So if we keep adding in the dimensions, we keep adding even more and more power that's getting generated from a smaller number of blocks. Now this does have limits. Once you get to about 1,000,000 power generation, the bonuses drop off and it actually does become more efficient just to shove these in any pattern you want. But up until that point, this can actually be a godsend for small ships. To give you an example, another example, I'll create a 5 by 5 by 5 cube of power blocks. Now, we've got 4,912 power per second this is generating. However, that's a lot of blocks. If I make a much smaller power generator, that's, let's say 7 by 5, well, 6, like that, although the total dimensions are larger, we used a considerably smaller amount of blocks. And we're currently at 3,000 power generation. There. All I had to do was add those couple extra blocks, and now we're well over that massive cube of power generation. This is actually much more efficient. But it gets better. You can actually create multiple generators that utilize the same amount of space. There. I've got 10, and I'll make it by 10. By 10. So, we've got this basic shape. We get plenty of power generation from it. How could we utilize this space more? Well, that's easy. We create more generators and just detach them from one another. This is probably my favorite way to create power generators because it allows me to use the benefits that I normally get from one and add it to up to 4 generators. So once I finish this one here, we've actually got 2 generators and they're getting a bonus from the same internal space. Now, we do lose a small amount of blocks because we have to have a block missing so that they don't connect to each other. If we connected them, we'd actually lose power generation. It goes from over 11,000 down to 7,100. That's a pretty big drop. And you can actually fit 4 of these corners to make a full 3-dimensional cube. I'll go ahead and finish filling that in right now. Alright, after completing this cube with the 4 separate power generators, I'm almost at 22,000 power generation per second, which is pretty good for using such a small amount of space. Now, if you really wanted to be efficient, you could continue making generators inside this generator to a point where they'd actually be fairly small and inefficient, but you would actually be getting the absolute most you could out of this space. To make a second internal generator, you have to make it a bit smaller than the original, but you can make it fairly big depending on the amount of space you initially were dealing with. And now I'm up to 25,000 power generation. And that's the basics of generating power, and it's pretty simple. I love using this design in most of my ships, especially the ones that aren't planet-killing titans, because I can actually just line the main portion of the hull with my power generators, and I don't need to place huge chunks of them around. Now, as for capacity's gotten a bit more important in the last few updates, it seems. And to give a basic example of how it works, I'm going to place 10. Now, these work a little bit differently than the generators, as the capacitors, the power capacitors do not need to have box dimensions involved. As you can see, I've placed 10, and the total amount of power storage I now have is a little over 60,000. So we can come up with a guess that each of these probably close to about 1,000 power per block that they can store. But if I connect the two, it jumped up to over 62,000. The reason is the more of these that are connected to each other, regardless of the shape that they're in, the more efficient they become. So by connecting a lot of them together, as opposed to having a whole bunch of smaller spread out chunks, you're going to actually end up saving quite a bit in the amount of blocks you have to use to get to the same amount of power storage. These are a lot more straightforward, and for that, I kind of like it. It's a good compliment, I think, that you have one portion of your power system being complicated to design while the other isn't. So even if your generation isn't very productive because you're not good at making efficient power generators, a new player can easily compensate for it by just throwing in tons and tons of these capacitors in a big block. And so even though power generation will be slow, they'll hold so much of it that they'll still be okay. Ideally, you would want both to be as efficient as possible to make a really nice ship, especially if you're going for a ship that's going to be effective in PvP combat. That's pretty much all there is to say about power, so I'll see you next time in my next tutorial.